Hi, good to see you all. Thank you so much. And so we have a community guest that I'll be introducing. And he's very familiar with the Leadership Africa program. He served for the community. But this is somebody that I've known since 1998. He's been a mentor of mine that really transformed my life. I met him when I just got to the United States, when I could barely put a sentence in English. I was working at a caricature store since my English was not good. My main responsibility was to stock books. So this gentleman was very patient with me, even though he could barely understand what I was saying and asking. And to fast forward 22, 23 years later, we've been in touch, been in contact. I cannot even tell you, I don't know how many PhD he has, but the thing that's more important is his heart for the community, his passion to teach. He's an educator since I met him, and is still teaching at School of Mine. And we have the amazing opportunity to have him throughout the journey. Spent time in South Africa, in so many different countries in Africa, but very involved also in the Black community. And as you know, part of one of the projects that we have in the African Leadership Group is the Breaking Barriers project, building bridges between the Black community and the African Immigrant Community. Typical to the organization, and some of the things that we are learning here is not to assume, even though we are all Black, but the reality is our journey is totally different. Some of the things that we've been through are totally different, so this will be an amazing opportunity for both communities to learn historically about things that the African continent been through and things that the Black community been through, and at the end we'll figure out a way to really come together as one. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Hudson. Thank you so much.
Do I have to have this?
So yes. Okay. Yes. All right.
All right. Well, good morning. So let me start with, this is so amazing. I mean, I have to admit, I'm a bit nervous because there's so much amazing energy in this room. And, you know, I teach at the School of Mines, and I do think that, and this is probably somewhat in terms of culture, there's sort of an engineering persona. And engineers are sort of trained to be what I sometimes call, be very lean on expression. So I'll be up here trying to make a joke and have some levity, and the students will just sort of be looking at me like, I think that was supposed to be funny, but I'm not really quite sure. But I think with you all, I won't have that problem at all. So this is really awesome. I wanted to quickly, though, present Papa with an award. So the Minority Engineering Program at the School of Mines, we always have a big banquet every year before graduation. And the Mines African Student Union, which I partnered with ALG, they wanted to give a shout out and award to Papa Dia. He came to the Mines campus to be our MLK speaker, and he's really been reaching out to those students, so they wanted to give him this award for the Community Partner Award. So thank you, Papa, for that.
Appreciate it. Thank you. To all of us, so thank you.
So I'm going to start with, and just as Effley said, you know, I'm not up here thinking that I know everything. I know a few things. And I just want to sort of be more reflective about my own journey. So I'm not trying to give a lecture, but just sort of share my own journey. I'm going to start with two stories. The first one was when I was in the 8th grade. And in the 8th grade, and I grew up in Summerdale, New Jersey. I'm an only child, and I distinctly remember that there was an offer from Time magazine, back when people read Time magazine. And it wasn't, and what enticed me was a map of the world. So I wanted that map of the world, because I had this sort of idea in my head that I want to travel everywhere on that map one day. But here comes true mea culpa. What place did I not want to go? Africa. Africa. was I associated Africa with being poor, the dark continent, not much there. But I would go to Asia, Latin America, Europe. That's true. So I didn't want to have anything to do with Africa. Fast forward, I grew up in New Jersey. In fact, I'll go to my slide deck here. And my parents were part of the last great migration of the 1960s. So I'm sure many of you know already there were these waves of migration of black folks from the American South to the American North. The first great wave started about 1890 after the fall of Reconstruction in the American South, 1877. So when Jim Crow set in, many African Americans started to move to the north. Another great migration was 1960 during the Civil Rights era. And my parents were part of that last great migration. They were born in the South, raised in the South. They got married in New Orleans. And my mom and dad moved from New Orleans to Cleveland, where I was born. So I was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1964, the same year that comprehensive civil rights legislation was being passed. So I sometimes like to pause on that just to remind people that we've only had comprehensive civil rights for all Americans my age, 58. So when you think about the longer trajectory of black people since 1500, we've only been in the law seen as fully human, right? We need to really sort of be mindful of that and how far we have come in spite of all of that. I think it's very, very important to emphasize that. And then my mom and dad went from Cleveland. They went to the projects in Buffalo. They went to Syracuse, Rochester, Harlem, and then North Philly in 1963-ish, 4, somewhere in there. And then in 1968, my dad got a tip for a new house in emerging suburbia, right? Suburbia. And the house was in Somerdale, New Jersey. Anyone want to guess how much the house was on the market for? $16,000. And for only $500 down and a 30-year fixed mortgage rate, this house could be yours. Isn't that amazing? $16,000. What's the price now in Denver? $500,000? I mean, it's just craziness. So when my mom and dad moved into 205 West Maiden Lane, it was a white neighborhood. Within 2 years, all of the white families had left because it was called blockbusting, as you all I'm sure know. So the white families were being approached. You've got these black families moving in, and you guys, say again?
Is that called white flight?
White flight, right? And it's associated with blockbusting. They're going to come in. We're going to offer you cash now before the value of your home keeps declining as more and more black families move in. So I was in an enclave, 8-block black community. I never got bused. So I walked to school, and then I would be around all white kids. So I went from a black enclaved neighborhood in Somerdale, New Jersey, and then I was in majority white schools my entire life. So I didn't really have this interaction or this dynamic of really thinking about being African American. I sort of just blended in. And I'm kind of a geeky kid, I'm a nerd, and I was really into reading and books. In fact, when I graduated high school, I was the highest ranking male out of 350 students. I was really an achiever. I went to the Air Force Academy, came out here. It's a funny story. My dad was really lamenting because he said, this kid is really smart, but I don't see a JOB at the end of all the things that he had an interest in. So I had interest in theology and art and politics and religion. And my dad's thinking, okay, what kind of a job is that going to become? Not really sure. So he said, could you just consider going to one of the military academies. I said, military? What are you talking about? There's no one in our family in the military. Didn't have that in my family at all. Didn't have anyone in the military at all in my family. So I said, well, let's see, West Point. Where's West Point? It's in New York. It's too close to home because I want to go far away from home to go to college. Where's the Naval Academy? It's in Maryland, a little further away, but water. Not far enough. Water, and you have to, every midshipman has to graduate, they have to jump off of a plank into the water because you're simulating leaving a burning ship. And I said, I don't think I'll be doing that. Don't think I'll be doing that. So I said, where's the Air Force Academy? It's in Colorado. I'll go there. That's about how I made the decision. That's not really too embellished. I said, well, you know, maybe planes, I might fly in a plane one day. That would be kind of cool. So, and I did really well in school, and I actually knew at that time Jim Florio. And Jim Florio had been a congressman. He ran for governor twice, and I had been an intern for him. So when I needed the all-important nomination, he knew who I was. And he said, well, I'll nominate him. He seems okay. And that's how I got in. Wow. And it's amazing. So I came out here, and then I went, oh my, what have I signed up for? I couldn't believe it. 5:30 in the morning, you're getting up. It's 7,500 feet. I thought I was all that in a bag of Doritos until we ran around that terrazzo a couple of times. I'm like, oh my gosh, what have I done? What have I done? Well, long story short, my point is it was predominantly white. There was only a token, one black cadet per squadron. So we had 40 squadrons. And in mine, we had two, me and Nate Wilson. So we were like a critical mass, almost, right? And again, I was predominantly around whites, totally not even aware of my blackness. That's what I'm trying to convey to you. It's honest. Sure. It's very honest. Then I left the academy, went to Italy for a year. Then I came back out to Colorado to attend the University of Denver because I wanted a PhD in international relations. I had a professor at the academy who was in political science and also at DU. So he had put a bug in my ear. You might want to apply for your PhD in international relations. So I came back out here in 1992. My point to tell you all this, that last bullet, I had not one single class in African or African American studies, all of that so-called stellar education, not one blasted course, if I may show a little anger, not one class. I took my first class in African studies at some podunk school, which actually changed my life, the University of Central Oklahoma. And John George, a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Ghana, was my instructor. And he was white. And he said, you know, you're a pretty sharp guy. You ought to get a PhD in international affairs, and you should study about Africa. I was the first person, I'm telling you, first person who actually proactively conveyed to me, why don't you study more about the African continent? So I was I think I was in my early 30s when I first got that sort of nudge. Isn't that amazing? And it's also rather tragic. I think one of you actually made a comment in one of your interviews. I think you might be here. And the comment that was made in the interview was, she felt, one of you I think is here, you said something to the effect, you felt sort of have felt cheated, that you've not learned about who we are. We've been spending so much time learning about everybody else, right? This is a big debate in a lot of the civil rights era between Malcolm X and King. Why are we so eager to always want to be like everybody else? Why don't we figure out who we are? And then we can move forward to what we want to be in this world, right? So I just tell you that, and then moving forward, here's my other story, my commensurate moment. When I was at the annual Denver Parade, So I'm sure many of you know it's one of the largest parades in the country to honor King's legacy and his birthday. And I was participating, and it was in the mid-1990s. And we were down at the Capitol, and someone approached me. So to your point, someone made an assumption about me, because obviously I'm African American, and they began to talk to me about King and his legacy, and I sort of said a few things, trying to sound like I knew what I was talking about, and realized I didn't know very much beyond I have a dream. Wow. I was pretty ashamed of myself. So that's why I call that my commencement moment. I made a decision. I need to commit in my academic trajectory to learn about Africa and African Americans. So that was a major pivot for me. And so I continued my studies at DU, and I declared African Studies as one of my subfields in IR. And at the time, Jindai Frazier, my mentor who came from Stanford, who was trained by Condoleezza Rice, was my advisor. So I really, really leaned on her to really train me well, and she did, I think. I mean, hopefully you'll think that as well, but I know that Jindai is amazing, right? So I did that, and I took my first academic position in African and African American Studies at Metropolitan State College of Denver when we renamed our department. It started as Black Studies in the 1960s. When I arrived there, we renamed it to African and African American Studies, and I'm happy to say now it's called Africana. So it's the entire Black diaspora, right? So I'm just trying to underscore why there's been this rift. I think that's kind of what I think Papa wanted me to sort of help sort of unpack from the academic point of view, why this rift. And now I'm at Colorado School of Mines, and I will tell you, I am the only faculty, the only social scientist on that campus. I'm the only social scientist, Black American, who teaches African and African American studies in the history of the institution. Wow. Right? And I don't say that as self-adulation. It is just to say there are so many places and spaces where we're not telling our story. And we must do it. We must do it. So that's a little bit about me. So I want to also just share a few things about why this rift has persisted and why I do think it's starting to come together. So Ali Mazrui, another one of my mentors, he hails from Kenya. So he speaks Swahili, and he's a practicing, he has passed on in 2014. He's Swahili, he was a practicing Muslim, and he was trained in the West. So there's an amazing series that you might want to Google called The Africans, A Triple Heritage. And I just make reference to that because what he would always try and convey whenever he would teach is that if you really want to start to get a handle on the Africans, you have to understand them as a walking triple heritage. There's a traditional Africans, which goes all the way back to the cradle of humanity. And then there's Islamic Africa, and then the West. What we tend to focus on is what? The Western impact on the continent. So he always tried to just be mindful to think about when you're engaging with people from the African continent, to think about this sort of triple heritage, to help you begin to really unpack, quote unquote, who the Africans are, right? So for instance, I sometimes will say that wherever the camel could not go is when Islam becomes Africanized. So people in Senegal have Africanized Islam. They've retained the Africanness of who they are, and they're also Muslim. So things like that just help you be a bit more aware of how to engage people on the African continent. Of course, there's one of my heroes, W.B. Du Bois, and this whole thing about double consciousness. I'm sure many of show of hands, you know what I'm referring to here a little bit. So it's the whole idea that one drop of black blood makes you black. So Ali Missouri actually has a segment in the Africans, it's the last segment, segment 9, in which he's in Charleston, South Carolina. And he's talking about, of course, the horrificness of the slave trade, and then he makes this comment, I'm paraphrasing, that one of the longer trend lines for people of African ancestry in the United States is that people of African ancestry were told to forget where you came from, but remember your skin color. Let me say that again. Forget where you came from, but remember your skin color. So what are you doing to people? You are creating double consciousness in them. And that's very, very unsettling and fragmenting. And so that's where this phrase of double consciousness came from when Du Bois was writing The Soul of Black Folk in 1903. And so, he was really engaged in a major debate with his contemporary Booker T. Washington about what does it mean to be black? Booker T. made the point that coming out of slavery in the American South, that we had to figure out how to adapt to the transitioning economy in the United States. The South had been forced, as you know, to give up slavery, to give up free labor, to give up the agrarian society and move into a manufacturing society. So to be in all candor, we have to be very honest that much of what was going on in the United States was not about slavery, it was about the economy, right? Even Lincoln in the 1850s, he didn't care about slavery in the 1850s. I mean, I've read all of his letters. His mind changes during the war, which I can't unpack, I can't do it all in an hour. So my point is that Washington's view was that African Americans need to get practical skill sets. So all the things I even made reference to earlier about, civic virtue and politics, that has to wait. You got to find skill that you can thrive in the economy. Du Bois had the other view. No, we need to demand for full civic participation. As you know, he was the first African American to get his PhD from Harvard, 1898, and he led the effort to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909 in response to Plessy versus Ferguson. So that's a mouthful. But my point about that slide there is just simply that this has been sort of the trend line for many African Americans since being brought forcibly to the United States. Okay? All right. Moving on a bit. I think this is, I might move past this because I'm watching my time. Let me go to this slide real quickly. Now, it's important to note why I jumped to this slide. African Americans were definitely making attempts. That's why I jumped here. It's really important for me to underscore that African Americans have always been either overtly or covertly trying to reconnect to the continent. I want to really make that really clear. And so I do want to make this point about Ethiopianism. So after the war is over, the Civil War is over, many African Americans really start to actively think about the continent. And particularly Ethiopia came to the fore because, as we know, Ethiopia has, for its long, 3,000-year history, was never fully colonized by Europeans. I mean, the Italians tried twice, but for the most part, Ethiopia has always maintained its cultural cohesion. And so the term that you sometimes find in the African American literature is called Ethiopianism. It's kind of a mouthful, but the point is what? There was a real debate about where should African Americans go. If you think about this kind of a little bit for a moment, you think about the war has ended. Aside from the talented 10th, and African American men who fought in the military, we've got now 5 million internally displaced black people who are not citizens. Did you hear that? So what are we going to do with all of these 4 million former slaves? Are we going to incorporate them? What you were saying earlier, are we going to incorporate them into American society? It's going to take several amendments to even get to citizenship, let alone voting, right? So there's a big debate that some say, you know what, we need to try and to just assimilate and to integrate. That was the Washington and Douglas view, or to separate, which was Marcus Garvey. Always wear him very proudly on my vest, and Malcolm X. So this is another theme within the black experience. Do we integrate or do we stay separate? This has always been a major kind of conversation in the black community in the United States, this ongoing dialogue, right? And then moving forward here to the 1950s, so this will be a good point for me to kind of talk about the African experience in a moment, but I want to have you all pause because I'm feeling kind of like I'm talking too much, and I want to hear from you. So let me kind of go here for a moment. So the 1950s is when we see the great wave, the first great wave of African independence. So after World War II, there's a great big push, both in Europe and the United States, that we need to get rid of all these empires globally. And so kind of the talented 10th in Africa, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, these become sort of the George Washington class of African leaders in the 1950s. So as you all probably know, in 1957, Martin Luther King attended Kwame Nkrumah's inauguration to be the first Prime Minister of Ghana, March 6th to be exact, 3 days before the most important day of the year, my birthday, right? I got a little after, okay? 1957, and he was so inspired by what was going on the continent, it really helped propel him to really move forward with establishing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That same year, in 1957, was the beginning of the African Studies Association in the United States. Now, why am I making this point to you? There was a real sort of eagerness in the West to include the United States, to encourage Africans to come to the U.S. to study. If you think about it for a little bit, who has left Europe? We have a lot of Europeans who are coming over to the United States, many of them Jewish, and not just scientists, but social scientists, anthropologists. So the namesake of the University of Denver, the Joseph Corbell School, Madeleine Albright's father, he had fled Czechoslovakia in 1948 because of the Soviets. He came to Denver, and the leadership asked Joseph Corbell to start teaching classes in international relations theory. Then later, other I'm going to mispronounce his name, Melville Herskovits of Northwestern, founded what is still the largest African studies program in the world. And you notice these are top-tier schools. That's my point. And they're encouraging Africans to come. So my point is there was an actual sort of recruitment, an active recruitment, and then of course, what would be another reason why that's happening? We've got the backdrop of the Cold War. So there's an interest for the United States to co-opt Africans to align with the West and not with the Soviets. Does that make sense? And then alongside that, we also have the HBCUs that are also beginning to implement studies in black studies as well. So my point is there was a lot being offered to Africans to come to the United States. In the meantime, what was happening with African Americans? The exact opposite. Yeah. So that's why I might go back to this slide now. So the HBCUs came out of this. The elections, the election of 1877 was really dirty. It was a contested election. The Democrats and Republicans would not concede. So the deal that was struck was what? The Republicans can be the president if you take out federal troops. Because federal troops had been in the South since the end of the Civil War in 1865 to ensure that the South would not revert back to Department and Metro State. So that's good news. That's really, really good news. And many departments now in the United States have begun to merge Black studies, African American studies, African studies under the umbrella of Africana to include the Caribbean and African people of African ancestry globally. Let me stop there, because I think probably wanted me to say a few things about the African experience, a little bit more in depth, and I have a few slides to share with you.
My question is, what are some of the challenges? Because you see, like time is not at a standstill, and as time goes by, some of that history is kind of dying down.
Right.
Based on ages, and because there's a lot of people with a lot of knowledge, but then as time goes by, maybe they're becoming past. That has also been a very big challenge. Like for example, in Kenya, the younger generation doesn't know a lot of Kenya's history,
right.
And Kenya is only 59 years. There's a lot of history that a lot of young people doesn't know about Kenya. Right. So that's what are some of the challenges that like somebody like you would face, because as time goes by, that history is going away without nobody telling it.
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me personally, I think that's why in terms of building bridges, that's why I still teach through CEA as well, and I teach in their Department of Ethnic Studies. Because to your point, I want to try and convey the history of African Americans. As I should indicate, our younger generation, many of them don't know. And in fact, I ran into a former student at a 7-Eleven this past week, and we chatted for a moment, and then she said at the end of our quick conversation, I actually learned a lot from your class. So I think it's just, I'm being very anecdotal in my response, but it's so incumbent that we learn this history and keep telling it. Malcolm is here. What Vincent Harding would always do when he was alive is if he were here, he would have actually had us go around the room, and he would have all of you say your full name, then he would have you say your mother's name, then he would have you say your mother's name, then he would have you say, where did she grow up, and where did she grow up? Why would he do that? Because he wants us to keep telling our stories. It was brilliant. And in fact, if he were here, he would have not done this. He would have sat down here with no PowerPoint and done that. So that probably is more effective to do that with people that were around, to teach these students how to tell their stories. So my point is, can we find like really powerful, simple ways to get people to start telling their stories? And that young lady remembered that first lecture. Because I do that with every class I start, and the students are very uncomfortable. Well, what do you mean? And they're like, what? I said, know my mother's name? Yeah. And then Dr. Harding would be very mindful to make sure you say it with some energy. So don't just rush by your name. Say your name. Say your mother's name. And he would just have that sort of gravitas. But he was very gentle soul. But he had that gravitas about him. Say your name. Be proud of your name. And then he would, if he didn't understand you, sister, could you say it just a little slow for me? So I think I'm being somewhat anecdotal, but I found that was a very powerful way to get people to start how to tell their stories. So, I could say a lot more, which be much more high level, but I think that's a very, very powerful way to get people to do that.
Have you ever been to any part of Africa? Like, because I know you said you studied about it, but have you ever been to the continent? And where have you been?
Yeah, so I did my actual PhD research in South Africa. So I was looking at the role of black churches and their response to the apartheid regime. So I was looking at the Dutch Reformed churches, the Pentecostal churches, and the South African Council churches, which is the mirror to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So King used that model when he created the SCLC. So I did that in the early 2000s, and then I spent a lot of time in Kenya. In fact, I took a bunch of students when I was at Metro State for a whole month way back in 2007. My scholarship now is mainly in East Africa, namely Ethiopia. So I'm looking at the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or are you familiar with the GERD? And so it's a major game changer because it's the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa, the 7th largest globally, and Ethiopia will control the Nile headwaters. So it's a game changer around water. So for the first time in modern history, all of the upstream black African countries, Burundi, Malawi, South Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, they will control the water. So who is not playing along? Egypt. Oh, the Egyptians, along with the British, signed all of these agreements, air quotes, that essentially gave all the control of the Nile water to Egypt and the British. So when the black African countries, under the leadership of the Ethiopians, started to say, we want to reconfigure these agreements, Egypt has been dragging their feet the entire 30 years. So the concern is what? Is it going to be some sort of geopolitical upheaval around the water? And if you really start doing more of a deep dive, a lot of the other Gulf states who have never seemed to care a hoot about East Africa are now really, really concerned about that dam. So my new book is unpacking all that. So it'll come out next year. My book before that was on South Sudan. So as you may know, South Sudan became a country in 2011, long history. And unfortunately, the country has always struggled around building a constitution and what I call foreign over-intervention. So what do I mean by that? When it was Sudan, there was concern about bin Laden and terrorism in the north, the genocide in Darfur, and so on. So there's a lot of pressure to get Sudan to stay together, but finally, the international community said to the north and the south, make a decision, do you want to stay together or do you want a divorce? So the Sunnahs broke away, and unfortunately, though, South Sudan has really struggled. Another piece about that is that we have 4 to 5 million Southern Sudanese who are either internally displaced or don't live in their home country. Right? So I sometimes say to myself, I tend to write and think about things that a lot of people don't think about, but it's my commitment to write about them anyway. Right? Because we gotta tell these stories. We gotta tell these stories so people can know what's going on beyond the 4 corners of our world. Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much. Hello, Doctor. How are you doing? Thank you very much. Do you have a lot of black people in your class? Do you teach to a lot of black people?
So, Colorado School Lines, how should I put this charitably? On a good day, 1% of the student population is African American. On a good day. So that's about 40 to 50. So I'm very seldom have interaction with African American students. They seek me out, but it'll just be 1 student or 2 at the most. The African students are more present, kind of to the same point I made earlier. Africans are all about mines, oil, diamonds, petroleum engineering, hydro, So they know coming to mines is a place to go. So I actually have more interaction with African students than I do African American students, which in of itself is quite a very interesting dynamic. And many of the African students think I'm Ethiopian.
Yeah.
Right? They'll say that, and then especially if I then say I teach African studies. And then I say, well, actually I grew up in New Jersey. There's a little bit of confusion.
That brings me to my question.
Yes.
Because when you said, forget where you come from and remember your skin,
Right.
that's a way to separate people already.
Right.
And as we have a problem between African and African American, which is the reason why we're trying to build bridges,
Right.
with your background and you yourself at the beginning, you wanted to visit the world without Africa. How you gonna really impact the African American without being too partisan? Partisan. You know, stay inside, showing it really, because you are African American,
Right.
you know what you went through, and you know those African Americans who really don't consider Africa, right?
Right.
Now, if you really want to teach them, how you get into them without really creating that big shock there.
So you're asking if are you asking about me personally?
Yeah, you personally, how you approach that with African American, because it's not easy, you know it, because you went through it,
Right.
right?
Right.
So how do you approach it so that the African American will be more open, kind of?
I can answer the question now. So here's one thing that I do often when I teach African American history. So there's a really, really, really good text by the great historian Nell Painter, and it's called Creating Black Americans. She's very intentional with the word creating and black. And it's 2007, Harvard historian. And then she says 1619, creating African Americans from 1619 to the present. Here's what I always do whenever I teach that course. I tell the students, we're not going to start at 1619. Because if I go around the room to those students and I say, give me a word that comes up when you think of black or that year, regularly students will say slavery, bondage, poverty, etc. My point is what? They're overwhelmingly negative images. So I spend about a month talking about Africa. What was going on before? Where's my slide? I've got so much more what to do, but totally 12:40, right? So what was going on in Africa before 1619? And the whole thing around geography and how actually Africans had mastered their environment. Because I teach African development. So of course, we think in America, we're developed and Africa is not developed. Well, who's deciding that? I mean, sometimes my students really cannot handle it because they don't know where I'm going, but I tell them, you just have to roll with me. Because the point I'm making that no, Africans have quite well mastered how to live in the tropics. Thank you very much. They live in smaller groups. They were quote unquote, as the anthropologists would call them, hunter-gatherers. They lived away from water because they knew about what? Malaria. It was when Europeans come and they want to extract resources out of the continent that they forced Africans to water. See? So that's how I try to kind of maybe get at that so that they have a sense of what's going on in Africa before 1619. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's how I deal with that issue. But I don't want them thinking we're going to start with slavery. I want them to understand Africans had mastered farming. They knew how to grow crops like yams and cassava and sorghum. That precipitated the rise of Ghana, the rise of Songhai and Mali in West Africa. But again, you'd be right. If you don't teach it, people aren't going to know. So you must do it. So that's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's a great answer. Thank you very much. I've been a little bit emotional. Because the topic is really intense and sometimes hard to think about. And when you mentioned about the greatness of Africa, if you take Ethiopia, the long history, and the first university in the world is in Senegal, right? When you think of all that, and when you see now the situation, it's really, it makes me so sad. It just is a perplexing thing. How do you see, there is a lot of conspiracy behind that. There are internal, look at where Ethiopia is. I was almost crying earlier when you mentioned Ethiopia about the independence, the being never colonized. But look at the situation right now.
Right.
And the separation of North Sudan and South Sudan.
Right.
And what is when you see what is going on all around in Africa, and what is the conspiracy behind, and the problem, what makes every nation in Africa unstable or always being in crisis, and what is really behind all that?
Right.
Thank you.
That's a good segue to another one. So the short answer is, so I teach, as you know, I teach African development. I teach African politics and society. And I always start with this as one of my signature PowerPoints. So I think,
Research papers.
This is sort of the form, right? Right? This is part of the form, right? Now, this, I sometimes try to bring levity to this, but you're right, it's very intense. So there's von Hitler, right, of Germany, and Leopold II of Belgium. Those two conspired together because the West is starting to industrialize. Right, it's going through the Industrial Revolution, starts in 1800 in Britain, and keeps going. So the engine of capitalism is what? Find more markets, find more raw goods, and find more labor. So since slavery now was morally not allowed, Europeans now are starting to say, well, we'll just go to Africa directly. So Bismarck and Leopold had their eyes on certain parts of that continent, particularly Leopold II. He had his eyes on the DRC, because it had rubber. So they got together, and of course, as Papa's always saying, who's on the menu? Africans. They're not present. So the Europeans are making decisions civilized. Sometimes I get a little bit of awkward laughter from my audiences. I say, you can laugh a little bit, right? But the point is what? They're making decisions about that continent. Yeah. That's going to have a long-lasting impact. And so that's the map that the Europeans drew. And I always sort of note, right, the British, because they were a major naval power, I teach, again, political science as well, and I teach geopolitics and so on. So the British, Because they're a naval power, they want control of what? All the waters. Because if you want to be a superpower, my view, you have to have control of 2 oceans. That's why Russia's in the Ukraine. They want control of the Indian Ocean. Unless the Arctic melts from climate change, they have a problem. So that's why they're willing to cause all this upheaval to get to the Indian Ocean. The United States has been lucky geographically. We've had 2 big oceans and relatively weak neighbors. So we don't have any awareness about what that feels like when you don't have control of water. The British, being an island country, they said, well, we want to control all of these choke points. Okay? Oh, that's the British. Right there, Djibouti, right? Djibouti, a little part of Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, of course, the port of Sudan. I mean, I can go on and on. But my point is what? I don't think I have a slide here. No, I don't. But here's my point. I'll try to be more clear. Ali Missouri says that the grounding challenge for African countries is to think about, are you ethnic prone or are you ethnic proof? What does it mean by that? To your point. When this began to go independent, so that's the map of modern Africa, 57 countries. But as you all know in this room, those boundaries were drawn by Europeans. So Kenya has 42 or 43 ethnic groups in it. The ethnic group that was favored by the British were the Kikuyu. Why? Because they were farmers. So farming societies have a social hierarchy. They're settled. So the British could engage with them. The Maasai, when I'm trying to show levity, they were what? Mufasa. Lovers of animals. They don't respect these boundaries. So even when Kenyatta, when he was in the early days, called the Great Reconciler, well, a little bit later, he's smiling, once he got power, what did he do? He stacked the government with all Kikuyu. Those poor Maasai were not in the government. So what's my point? Africans have got to stop doing that. So what it really means, when you're ethnic prone, if you're sort of playing what Malcolm X would say, it's sort of like what Malcolm would sometimes say, you tie a chicken to the table, and initially it's trying to get away, it gives up after a while. And even when you cut the chain, Bob Marley, the chicken stays there. That's what Bob Marley's talking about, right? Because you're mentally thinking like a slave. So that's why Bob Marley was brilliant around those songs. So was Rui's point, before he passed on, he said to me, Africans have got to become, their societies have to learn how to be ethnic proof. The other example I might offer is Ghana. They seem to have gotten that somewhat figured out. So they rotate amongst all their ethnic groups, they have elections. So it's built into their constitution to do that. So at least there's a sort of energy around, this is how we need to govern ourselves, to be ethnic proof. But you're right, we really have to be, for you all as leaders, to really learn how to do that well. Because in the West, you see, we're all about democracy and liberty and all of these propositional things, which are very, very important, don't get me wrong. But why am I so talking like that for a moment? Virtually, people resonate with their language, with their ethnicity, with their language, with their religion. So here in the West, we sort of kind of forget, air quotes, there's something called race that was created by the West. I mean, you could argue it was Thomas Jefferson, the founding father, who coined race because he had a suspicion when he was observing people of European ancestry, people of African ancestry, and Native Americans, although he had very little direct contact with them, so he had a very romantic view of them. But if you talk to the white settlers on the frontier, not so much. So I know this long answer to your question, but that would be my, since I don't have a lot of time, that would be my big takeaway. is African societies have to figure out how to learn to be ethnic truth. So, for instance, in Kenya, there's some conversation that people along the coast might need to be a somewhat more sort of semi-autonomous entity, so like Catalonia in Spain. Because the culture of the coastal peoples in Kenya are very different than the Lua in Western Kenya. But it's going to take a lot of good conversation to be able to do that. And so my lament to your point about South Sudan is that we're not even to the point of a constitution yet. Because Salva Kiir and Riek Machar are using ethnicity to keep themselves in power. I do also want to make sure I underscore, I know I talk a lot, I'm sorry, is that the root issue is really not ethnicity. The Europeans created that. Because Rwanda, the iconic example of the so-called Tutsi and Hutu, that was not, they were unranked ethnic groups. What I mean by unranked? You could become one or the other through marriage or wealth. You could move back and forth. It was seamless. It was when the Europeans come, they made them what? Ranked. And they made a caste system. And then they favor one over the other, and that has perpetuated. So we have to undo the ranked way of thinking about ethnicity across many of these countries. So it's going to take a lot of intellectual, spiritual energy to change that. And that's my job as an academic. So, am I talking too much?
No, you're great.
Yes.
So let's do part 1, 2, 7 questions.
Okay.
So the first one, and I just wanted to ask you, did you ever do your ancestry DNA? Did you ever?
Yeah, I should have brought them in. I actually did. I actually, years ago, you all know Rick Kittles? So he actually did Oprah Winfrey's DNA.
Oh, yeah.
So Rick Kittles came to Metro State when I was there. We brought him there. And he has the world's largest database to learn your African DNA. So on my mother's side, I am 50% Yoruba
Oh, Nigeria.
and 50% of Fulani Hausa, which comes from the east.
So Nigeria.
Chad and Sudan.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And on my father's side, most of my African DNA comes from the modern country of Gabon. So, I mean, it's kind of expensive, but I think it's really wonderful to have the experience. I sometimes will have an exercise in my class, or have the students figure out who I am. It's a great activity. To have them do that. It'd be great.
Where is Gabon on the map?
Gabon is right.
Thank you.
Oil-rich country, former Portuguese.
How do you spell it? Gabon.
Gabon.
Oh, Gabon. Okay.
What else can I share?
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
And I hear you talking a lot about other countries in Africa, and it's not just, it's a lot of speakers and stuff, but they never mention Liberia. It's like, we don't even exist. Like every single time, everywhere I go, they'll talk about all these countries in Africa, like Ethiopia and Sudan and Kenya and stuff, but they never, like, even Ghana, Nigeria, but never Liberia. Like, what's up with that?
And that's
what is the idea of Liberia? That's a good point. Go there. So Liberia is right there, and it kind of sounds like liberty. What's the capital of Liberia? Freetown. And then Sierra Leone, right next to it, is British. So I'm going to answer the question. Well, these were created by the Americans and by the British to do for what? When slavery would end one day, all the black people are going to go down, which I just find laughable. That the Europeans sort of concocted this idea. Like, and with a view on the so-called black elites who were saying, well, that's a good idea. But as to your point, the millions of Africans in slavery are thinking, I don't actually speak any languages on the African continent. I speak English, and I've been laboring in this country. Why am I leaving? Who's telling me that I should leave? My point is simply is what, it wasn't like it was a collective conversation about my point. But that is, what you're right, that's where it came from. The idea was, when slavery would eventually end, this would be the destination for former slaves.
And that kind of happened though, because some of them did go back, right?
Right, and some did. That's that whole thing that I made reference to earlier, the should we stay, should we go? And Garvey actually was trying to get it all set up for people to leave at the United States. Right, Garveyism. Any more I can share with you? Are you tired of me? 3 minutes to lunch?
We're not tired.
You're not tired? There's so much up here that I can comment. So let me maybe go here for a minute. This is sort of maybe it's a key piece about the waves of African independence. So you hand this.
So I'm gonna speak for myself. I'm not gonna speak for anybody else. So as Black America, as they put us in, you know, this, you're white, you're Black, you're Hispanic, you're this, or that. We have lost everything. I say that because if I do take that test of my DNA, I'm gonna be a part of probably 30 different places. And then it's like, okay, so who am I really? Like, who am I really? Like one person. And we can't really say that as Black Americans. So it's like, to answer some of the questions, I feel like to get a Black American person that at your college, we pay for, when you're in college, you pay for your classes. So why would I wanna, I would say most people it's out of ignorance why they won't come to you, especially when it comes to us Black America, because we feel like we've arrived when we're especially at Carl School of Mines because that's an elite college.
Right.
So that's to answer your question, why we don't go to seek him out. And most Africans will seek him out because they come here to learn, get educated, and bridge the gap between Africa and America. So that's.
Important to say that.
I think I have a comment on that. You know the way you putting it, like when you do your DNA, you might be coming from 30 different places. We Africans also face that. Because you see, like, for example, you can go to, like, say, Mozambique, and you find a group of people that look like us, you know, like our tribe. And you're like, there must be a connection because the way they talk, the way they behave, the way they, you know, there must be a connection between me and them. But then as you were taken, maybe one of us was, maybe our group was taken from there and it ended up in Kenya. So that also happens because as you also have that, we don't call it an identity crisis, but I think when the colonizers came, they did a lot of things that we don't know.
Yeah.
So that some of us ended in Kenya, and maybe we have like our cousins in South Africa. They speak like us, they behave like us, everything they do, it's all, you know.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing. So whatever you're facing, you're also facing that in Africa. That's my comment.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very emotional. I'm from Tanzania. My mother and my father are 100% Tanzanians. But my last name is Bureta. And when I grew up, I didn't know, it was like, it's not an African name. Where am I from? And I did some research. When I came to America 22 years ago, I Googled the name Bureta, and I found a lot of them. And I made phone calls. I was like, oh, I have relatives here. They were white people. One lady I called, she was 102, and she told me she was white. And I'm like, so where did this come from? So I was in a confusion and I didn't understand. My grandparents have already died and their fathers have already died, and I don't know how to go there. We cannot go to Africa and do DNA. So it's kind of confusion. I got kind of emotion. But I tried to figure out where did that name from, because I asked that 102 years old lady on the phone that where was her origin. Her origin was her parents or grandparents came from Italy. And I just wanted to add on what my brother said, that really, though we are from Africa, we really don't know how did it happen. My tribe in Tanzania, I'm a Chaga. They've been trying to send a lot of documents, and I've been trying to research where we really came from. Where did Italians in Africa came? And I found out that they were a little bit in Ethiopia. And then when I studied about my tribe, they called us that we were the Black Jews who migrated south. So I'm like, okay, so am I a Jew or am I Ethiopian? What am I? I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is, I think I still want to know. And I'm gonna work on it, because when you're saying, like, if Martin Luther King was here, would have asked you who's your grandmother, who's your grandmother's mother, and I'm trying to go. I started writing, and I'm like, I could only go to 3. I don't know more than that. And my children were born in America. They only know my mother, and I'm like, this is really sad. We don't even know who we are, but it's good to know who you are. Not for anything, not to confuse you, not to make anything crazy, but it's good to know who you are. Don't look at it on a negative way. I'm looking at it in a way that I just want to know, who am I? I just want to know my tribe. My tribe are business people, and they say, oh, that's why we were Black Jews. We just like to make money. You go anywhere in the world, you'll find a Chaga somewhere trying to, either they have a shop, they're selling something. So I will encourage us, and all my African American friends, I always tell them, I'm going to Tanzania, come on, let's go. I'm going next month, I'll still say, come on, let's go. The tickets are high, but come on, let's go. Please, I want to encourage us. I was getting very emotional, I cried a little bit. But I want to encourage us, it's okay to find who you are. Even though you think you're from Senegal, you might not even be from Senegal, because you don't know. So I just want to encourage my sister, don't be confused, don't let it, like, if I come from 30 other things, 30 countries, I think it's good to know where your blood is from. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going back.
I can definitely appreciate what Ikunda just said. And I'll say this, who I am and where I'm from are two different things. I think as an African American woman, and this is what I love about this particular forum or opportunity platform, if you will, is that I don't know necessarily who I am because my origin that I know of is America. Now, I just did AfricanAncestry.com, and so I have learned more. But I think a lot of times for us as African Americans, particularly in the United States, we try to figure out how to survive, right? Like, we're not asking those questions because there's a hierarchy of values for us, and one of them is eating. And so because there is such a struggle here, for on many planes, just to be able to be seen as a person here in America. Like, I feel like a lot of times there are those who think because we were born in America, we have certain advantages. But us as African Americans think because you were born in Africa, you have certain advantages. And so because you know where you are from, although they're two different things, you know that. I have not had that opportunity. I have just recently learned some things. And again, it's not because I don't want to know, it's because there's a hierarchy of values. There's a hierarchy of, is this more important or is this more important? And sometimes I'm chasing what's more important to me at the time. And so while I agree absolutely with that, I will say this, it has taken me to where I'm much older in life to take the time to do that. Not blaming anybody. I'll take responsibility for that. That is just the reality.
Very interesting so far. Prof, you spoke about the concept of ethnic proof. And it's something I want to, dive a little deeper into. But I think even though that's a part of the African problem, there's a bigger problem. The African continent is badly managed because I think number one is corruption.
Yes.
Our leaders are just very, very selfish. And I think that's a bigger concern. If the African continent is properly run, it will impact Africans around the world. So the African story in America and everywhere else in the world will be better if the African continent is better. So I think that for me, talking about the hierarchy of, what's more important, I think that's more important to me than knowing where I'm from. I want to know where I'm from. It's fun, like Ikunda said. I'm interested in knowing my ancestry. In fact, my wife is African American. She wasn't born on the African continent, and I was curious to know where she was and what her ancestry was. And I found out that she was half Nigerian, just like I am, and that was very interesting. But I don't care where you're from. It's who are you is more important, and how do we make the African continent better, and it's going to impact the rest of the African ancestry wherever we are in the world. I just wanted to put that out there. Yeah.
Sometimes we'll say that we've had 3 generations of African leaders.
This is a beautiful conversation that we're having. For me, I have both the best worlds, if that makes sense, because my parents are Liberian, and so hold on. I talk about this because I grew up excuse me, I'm the first male to cry, so it's all right.
It's a good example.
Good example. My second cohort actually had me crying too, so there's a lot I have inside. But I grew up in an African home, even though I'm a black male. And so I navigate through life like that. I'm gonna get it. Appreciate it. So, thank you, I'm good now. So I grow up in a black home, African home, and then navigate through life. And people see me as an African American, right? But I have the traditions, the values from an African mother, family. And so why I say that is because we are all diverse. Even in my African family, we are diverse. We have roots from Barbados, we have roots from Jamaica, we have French roots. And I say that because that's what makes me who I am. And so when I walk into a room, people see me as just a black male until I say who I am. And that's what we need to do, is say who we are. When we enter any type of room, we need to say who we are.
Many different things today. And I just want to touch on something you talk about, the generation breaking that tied chicken's leg, and that mentality getting out of there. And then what Mr. White mentioned earlier, how do we train this next generation, especially holding on to those historic ideas and facts. And as we know, Africa has the youngest population in the world right now. And how can we arouse this young population to do more for this continent? Because for us to fully develop, we have to be able to keep this young population there. Because a lot of everybody wants to go to America, to the Europeans, and because there's no resources in Africa. I mean, there's resources, but China, America, France. France ain't nothing without Africa, basically. France is an African colony, to be honest, because everything depends on Africa. And how do we? And I'm just asking, how do we grow this young population to believe in this new mentality that Africa is the future? There's things you could do back home that you could create for your own self. Like, how do we fully develop that capacity, especially with this young population? And right now, I think neocolonization is still happening at a high speed just because China's coming in, India's coming in. Now it's not just the West, It's other continents. Russia's involved as well. So how do we keep? Because for me, I really want this continent to grow, and I just think it starts with the young population. How we develop this young next generation.
I wanted to thank you for being here and for sharing the way you have today. It's beautiful. I'm glad that we have this as part of the Leadership Africa cohort. Thank you for being here. I don't know if you got a chance to speak in the first cohort, but this is very powerful, and I appreciate it. I'm sure everyone else does too. I just wanted to say something about Ethiopia in terms of the dam. That Ethiopia was pushed and forced into that position to fund their own construction of the dam, because Egypt had talked to America and to the British and to the International Monetary Fund and to the World Fund not to fund the building of the dam. So Ethiopia was forced, because everyone bought into the lies that they would not have access to the Nile, to the water. So especially Egypt said, if you don't fund them, then we can help you with the Mideast crisis, the Mideast peace crisis. You see? So Ethiopia was forced to do it on their own without asking for money from anyone else. That's part of that. The other thing I wanted to highlight was Usman asked a very important question, and I think this man here can answer that question, because he's one of the leaders right now in Senegal, in Africa, dealing with young people, looking at the future of the politics and the millennials in Senegal, is that man right there. And I think he can answer a lot of those questions concerning the future of Africa.
Thank you.